one of the what I consider one of the penultimate authors in the world today. Peter Levenda has come out with book 2 of Sinister Forces, and you remember, I'm sure, the book 1 interview we did. If you're an unknowncountry.com subscriber, you can listen to that interview again if you wish. It is still in the subscriber section, and in any case, that or not, you can listen to this interview, and believe me, this is no sequel, but rather a continuation into modern times with all new material and new facts. Book 1 stopped pretty much with the Kennedy assassination, but that was not the end of this problem. And Peter, I think that the best way to start with you, first, welcome to the show again.
Oh, thank you very much.
Oh, yes.
Happy to be here.
Oh, well, I'm delighted to have you here. My respect for Peter Levenda is just boundless for the effort that he's making. What is the problem? You call this series a grimoire of American political witchcraft. Why?
That's a very good question, actually. I took the idea of political witchcraft from an article that had appeared in the Village Voice right around the time of the Watergate hearings had just begun. And a journalist by the name of Craig Carpel had written a 2-part series in the Village Voice called Political Witchcraft. And it sort of blew me away because what he did is he juxtaposed things like the Manson killings with Richard Nixon proclaiming Manson guilty, and then going on to E. Howard Hunt, who was one of the Watergate burglars, former CIA officer at the Bay of Pigs. And E. Howard Hunt had written a series of occult novels. And he started bringing all of these various threads in a very short 2-part series. And it really ignited something inside of me. And I said, this is a fascinating way to look at our modern age. We're so used to, in the United States, of thinking that politics and religion, or let's say politics and spirituality, are separated. I mean, they're separated in our Constitution by law, the separation of church and state. However, that doesn't really happen in reality. We have religious people in political positions or positions of political power making decisions that may be formed by spiritual or religious ideas, some of which may be shocking to us if we knew what they were. So I began to research the connections between church and state, if you will, between political figures and their occult or religious beliefs. And I found just an enormous treasure trove of material that people ordinarily ignore. And I think it's important to look at this material because the people making decisions affecting all of our lives are people who have religious or spiritual ideas with which we may not really agree. We had a president, Ronald Reagan, who was a firm believer in the end of days, in the apocalyptic prophecies of the Bible.
We have another one now, George Bush. Now, let's just stop right here because this is very important. In fact, the book of Revelation and the prospect of the impending end of days have animated American foreign policy thinking for almost 2 generations at this point. First with the Reagan administration, and now with this second Bush administration. And tell us a little bit about, first starting with Reagan, how this has affected our political life and our country's life and our foreign policy.
Well, what it did is it elevated, if you will, the discussion about politics between capitalism and communism back in the 1980s, in the time of the Cold War, into a spiritual discussion. And this is what was so disturbing to me, was because suddenly we are casting our political enemies as spiritual enemies. It's the war between light and darkness. Now, that was fine for the conservatives, for Republican outlook. I mean, the Republicans detested the Democratic approach, which was more of appeasement or negotiation or finding some sort of common ground. The Republican political philosophy was not to enter into these types of negotiations, but to expend power as much as possible. And the only way to get most Americans in the 1980s, the me generation, behind this kind of political idea was to cast it in spiritual terms. Suddenly the Soviet Union became the evil empire. It was a satanic organization. All of this type of end-of-days vocabulary Reagan used with abandon. And what that did was set us up for what is happening now. By casting international politics in a religious or spiritual conflict paradigm, what we've done is we've opened the door for other groups that have spiritual agendas to cast us as the enemy, to cast us as the warriors of darkness versus the warriors of light. This is the kind of a situation we can't easily get out of at this point. We have got to address our enemies now in these spiritual terms. I mean, communism basically has been destroyed, or at least it's been quieted down considerably. The Soviet Union fell. Cuba is surrounded and struggle is hardly recognizable as a communist state anymore. So who becomes the enemy? Once Reagan put everything into this end of days Book of Revelation context, it didn't just suddenly go away. I mean, the Messiah didn't come, the third temple wasn't built. None of the things that the apocalyptic neocons are looking for have taken place yet. So obviously we need another spiritual enemy. And I think we found spiritual enemies in the Middle East, for instance. So now we are involved in a relationship in the Middle East that is tailor-made for the neoconservatives and some Christian elements who want to ensure that a third temple in Israel is built. And the only way that's going to happen is that if there is a war with the Middle East, Arab countries, Islamic countries, in which a way is paved for the building of the temple on what is now the Dome of the Rock. I mean, we went from fighting communism, godless communism, remember that. I mean, we already put it into religious terms because the communists were against religion. And we went from there into now states which have different gods than we do. I mean, it's a very tight little thick kind of nucleus that we're now involved in struggling to get out of. And unless we can change the vocabulary of this type of struggle, we are stuck with it. We are stuck with fighting religious war.
And yet, there is something very wrong here. There's a discordant note. It would be one thing if the knights of religion were actually the knights of the religion they pretend to defend. But that's not quite true. It would be, let's start. We're going to get, of course, into Skull and Bones and that all of the secret societies and so on and so forth in a few minutes. We're going to be discussing Porter Goss, by the way, folks, who's an interesting and scary guy, and who happens to now to run the CIA and is almost certainly running it into the ground beyond, I mean, how deep can it be driven into the ground? I don't know. But anyway, let's start with Nancy Reagan and something that does not fit the fundamentalist Christian modality at all, which is her use of astrology. And we're going to get into Gene Dixon, too, but let's start with Nancy Reagan.
Well, Nancy Reagan is a fun place to start. I mean, we are looking at a former actress, as Ronald Reagan was a former actor. We suddenly have people who are schooled in the art of becoming other people in the first place. Maybe in the case of Reagan and Nancy, maybe not that well. I mean, we're talking about basically B-list movie stars, but they were Hollywood figures. They were actors and actresses, an actor and an actress. These were people who understood about manipulating reality. When we talk about Nancy Reagan, we talk about a person who looked behind the veil of reality, let's say, just from her own life and her own marriage to Ronald Reagan, and saw that astrology was a way of understanding or controlling or manipulating or dealing with this unseen world that as actors and actresses, some drama professionals do come in contact with through method acting, through the Stanislavski method and all of that. They imitate hypnotic states. They imitate trance states, in a sense, shamanistic states. So we have Nancy Reagan, a devoted fan of astrology, with really exorbitant power in the White House, especially after the assassination attempt on Reagan, who is now basically organizing the president's schedule around astrology. Now, this was something that was done in many ancient cultures around the world. It was done in ancient China. It was done in India. It was done in Europe for a long time. There were viziers, or there were advisors to kings and emperors who used astrology to determine when a date was good for a battle or for a coronation, that sort of thing. And in Nancy Reagan, we simply have another manifestation of the same thing. However, those of us in the rest of the world who may or may not really ascribe to notions of astrology were horrified to learn that Nancy Reagan was setting up the schedule of the most powerful man in the world based upon astrological portents. And the problem with astrology in this case is that it's only as good as the astrologer you're using. So we had to hope, keep our fingers crossed, that Nancy's astrologer was really top-notch, because if she wasn't, we would have had a problem on our hands, possibly. During World War II, astrology
who was Nancy's astrologer?
Oh, I forget her name. It's in my book, I believe, but
Oh, okay.
Totally
Well, we won't. Obviously, yeah. That's not a path we need to go down then, because
I don't think we need to. No.
Okay. Now, that does not really jibe very well with fundamentalism of Christianity, which is a specific prohibition against consulting soothsayers, and astrology and fundamentalism are not mixed.
Well, I kind of look at Ronald and Nancy as the sort of new age a paradigm for our society. I mean, you have religious people who are also dabbling in astrology. It's hard to take all of this really very seriously, except that
the life of the United States
was exactly in the hands of these people. Now, Ronald Reagan's religiosity, let's look at Ronald Reagan's spiritual background to see how this might have fit with Nancy's astrology.
Okay, we're going to take a little break, though, Peter, first, because
Sure.
We will be back in just a couple of minutes with Peter Levenda, and then we're going to get into Ronald Reagan's spirituality. We're going to get into Skull and Bones, and we're going to lead right up into modern times and the big questions that arise of who is Porter Goss, for example. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're talking to Peter Levenda, his phenomenal new book, Sinister Forces, Book 2, A Warm Gun. You can get it from the unknowncountry.com bookstore. There's a great deal on it right now, so do go to unknowncountry.com. Click on the store tab. You can't miss it. Plus, if you don't have both volumes, you can get them both at a fabulous price. And it's hard to find in bookstores, I think, and not every bookstore carries it, because there's a resistance, isn't there, Peter, at this point? People will, the Christian fundamentalist community is getting so powerful that bookstores are hesitant about certain really scary books that are saying that behind the curtain there is something very different from what appears in front of it. So, but let's return now to the Reagans and to Ronald Reagan's spirituality.
Okay. When we're talking about Ronald Reagan's spirituality, we have to look at a lot of religious history, and to make a long story short, Reagan belonged to a Protestant sect called the Disciples of Christ, I believe. And it was, oddly enough, it was the same sect to which Jim Jones belonged, of the famous Jonestown, Guyana massacre back in 1978. If you remember, Jim Jones led a religious group out of San Francisco at the time.
And we will get into that, too.
Yeah. Well, Jones, of course, that's a whole other story, and that's a really fascinating background. But to discover that both Jim Jones and Ronald Reagan belong to the same apocalyptic cult is something that I found really tremendously disturbing. I couldn't understand how that could have happened. But Jim Jones, of course, had his own version of this, and he perverted the original message of the disciples of Christ into something else that's completely different. But the People's Temple of Jim Jones was originally this apocalyptic sect, which believed in the end of days, which believed that the time of the second coming was drawing near, that the signs in the heavens were all pointing to the end of civilization as we know it, the coming of the Antichrist, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we had a president in Ronald Reagan who believed in all of this, who embraced it. We understand Iran-Contra in that context. We understand how he could have been involved in ignoring Congress, for instance, and supplying the Nicaraguan Contras and in dealing guns for hostages and all the things that took place with Iran and with Nicaragua. I mean, for those of you who are really paranoid, and I fall into that club every now and then myself, I look at the fact that, believe it or not, I look at the fact that the Iran hostage crisis ended the moment that Reagan became inaugurated as president. I find that to be extremely suggestive. And when I went back to look at history to find out what Reagan was doing and what the other Republicans were doing, we find that Nixon himself, Richard Nixon, the disgraced former president, was looking for ways to deal with the hostages and was kind of a backdoor to the Reagan campaign people in how to deal with the Iran hostage crisis. There was a deliberate attempt by Republicans, I believe, to make sure that Carter would not have been able to rescue the hostages before the inauguration, or before the election at least.
I've heard whispers of sabotage in the desert, by the way, that some valves were put into the engines of aircraft that were not cleared for use in sand, and this is why those planes all conked out and when they attempted to land in the desert in Iran at that time.
That's what I heard as well.
Yes,
and that's also very disturbing. The idea that we could have rescued the hostages much earlier. It's known. It's
apparently a story that emanates from Zbigniew Brzezinski.
Yeah. And he would have known. I mean, he would have had a backdoor to that information.
He would have known. Yeah, I mean that he certainly wouldn't have been responsible for it. But I think after the fact, he learned that this had been done within the military for the purpose of sabotaging that mission and making sure the Carter administration failed.
Well, a former member of the administration, Gary Sick, wrote a book called I believe it was called October Surprise, about this whole thing, and he's of the firm belief that this was all orchestrated by the Republican Party. Looking back on Nixon's own role and the things that Nixon was involved with since the beginning of his political career in the immediate post-war period, we can see that this was not out of the question for Nixon and his style of Republican Party. So why would it have been different with Reagan? I mean, it appears that Nixon was capable of anything. I mean, beginning with painting his opponents as communists, painting Helen Hagen Douglas as Jewish, which is reprehensible when you think that it was only a few years since they liberated the concentration camps, and Nixon begins a whisper campaign against his opponent, saying that she's Jewish.
Well,
and that
Nixon did not like Jews.
No, he did not
at all. No, he was very anti-Semitic. I mean, I to be honest with you, I know people who knew him quite well. I've been in the world I've lived in my life has been a sort of world in the I would describe it in the second orbit around the presidency for many years, ever since I was a boy. And he was extremely he hated Jews. He was very anti-Semitic. I can't say that's true of many presidents, but he was just exceptionally that way.
And that's not to say that because he had Henry Kissinger advising him that he wasn't anti-Semitic. A lot of people point to the fact that, he hired Kissinger. That does not detract from all of the Oval Office tapes, which will make your ears bleed to listen to them sometimes. The kind of oaths and imprecations that Nixon used against Jews and against New York City, for instance, and because it was perceived by him to be Jewish, and the newspapers were Jewish. I mean, Nixon had this kind of I hesitate to use the word Nazi, but let's say an anti-Semitic position anyway.
Well,
and we cannot
but
paint all the Republicans this way. But
the ideals of Nazism defined as order and the purest race in power. Those ideals are behind, they're in the shadows of our world still today. I think you would agree with that. More than in the shadows to a degree.
Well, I do. I mean, probably people reading Sinister Forces, looking at what I've covered in the 2 volumes, are saying, well, why are you focusing so much on the Republican Party at various times? And the reason is simple. For some reason, and this is not true of all Republicans, but it may be true of the inner workings of the party, for some reason, the Republicans have always had no problem in dealing with the Third Reich. I mean, since its inception, since the 1920s and 30s, we have the Bushes and the Walkers, the people involved in finance and banking in New York and in the United States.
Why don't we talk? Let's diverge a little bit and talk a bit about that, because it is important. And now, bearing in mind that the current Bushes are not Nazis. George W. Bush, the President of the United States, is not a sympathizer of Nazis.
No.
But
no, and I'm not trying to. No.
And that's not what we're really trying to say. But there is a way of thinking that emerges out of his grandfather's mind and out of a long tradition in that family and in the Walker family, which is intimately related to it in a lot of different ways, of authoritarianism, that the people who are right, that is to say, the ones on the far right, them, who live by a code of protecting the assets of the wealthy and sympathetic, those people should have the right to rule regardless of the freedoms that have been granted by any given nation state to its population. And their ability to do this should be worldwide. It should be completely unfettered. And ultimately, if it means that a tiny oligarchy gains complete power over the planet, and that power is maintained by force of arms, by mind control, by whatever means necessary, that's okay. And that is a problem. It is a huge problem. Now, let's go back.
That's very well put, exactly.
Yeah. Let's go back, because we're not talking about secret Nazis now. We're talking about a way of thinking that emerged out of appreciation for Adolf Hitler's ideas and mainly his idea that one man's authority, a man who was right and who knew what he was doing, that was the most important source of power in the world. So let's talk about Prescott Bush.
Okay, well, going back to Prescott Bush, we're going back to the 1920s, the 1930s. We're going back to the very origins of the Nazi Party in Germany, where the Bushes felt that Hitler and his party were pretty much in alignment with their point of view. They were racial elitists, the Bush family at the time. They were anti-Semitic. They were pro-eugenics. I mean, they believed that cleansing the race, and by that we usually refer to the white race, of inferior elements was something that was desirable. To do it through breeding, to do it through whatever means necessary. And so they invited Nazi scientists, eugenics experts to the United States, paid for their voyage over to the United States, to have a eugenics conference in the United States, in New York City. The Bush family paid for all of this. I mean, they were so heavily involved with this idea that racial superiority was important, and that race should determine your position in life and your leadership capability and all the rest of it. So these persons, the Bush and the Walker families, which eventually gave rise to George Herbert Walker Bush and George Walker, Bush, these people were racist. I mean, there's no way around it. They were fascists. We're not talking, again, about secret Nazis. These people were so pro-Nazi that their assets were seized and their companies were closed during World War II as part of the Trading with the Enemy Act. Yeah.
Peter, we've got to take a little break. Peter Levenda's fabulous new book, Sinister Forces, Book 2, A Warm Gun. If you've got Book 1, you must get this, and you will have received a coupon from the unknowncountry.com store for a special price on Book 2. Don't miss it. Plus, if you get Books 1 and 2 together, you'll find a special price on both volumes taken together in the unknowncountry.com store. Plus, the price right now is great anyway, so it's a terrific time to get Sinister Forces Book 2. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber, It's Dreamland, and I would like to jump ahead to the present just briefly to discuss how the family tradition of support of racial things like racial purity and eugenics is reflected in our modern world. It's reflected in primarily in the largest level thinking within the Bush family and the Bush administration in the idea that the weak should not receive the support of the state, that everyone is simply what they should have available to them, the asset and the support they should have available to them should be whatever they personally have, whatever assets they personally have. In other words, this is behind the idea of the privatization of Social Security. Let the weak fail. That is the idea that is still very alive in the overall ideology of this family. Let the weak fail. Now, I think personally this is a profoundly decivilizing idea. It is the purpose of civilization, in part, is to help the weak succeed at the expense of the strong. And the result of that is, of course, that the semi-autistic little black kid from the ghetto who turns out to be a great mathematical genius gets his place in the world, in the sunshine. If you do it the other way, what you get are the strong, usually very bright, often very cruel, and very often you end up in a situation like medieval Europe with a tiny overclass so far in advance of the little guy that they're like two different species. So let's continue on. And I'm sorry to go on a soapbox here, folks, and please forgive me. I know that a lot of you will write and say, you're talking too much on the show. We want to hear Peter Levenda. You're absolutely correct. I am corrected, and I will shut up now. And now let's go back now. And I want to now move to the origins of Skull and Bones and to the origins of that other society, the name of which, as I'm talking, the one that changed its name, the Fence Club, 1934.
The Fence Club, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, and let's go backwards. The last election, 15 people a year are inducted into Skull and Bones. It's a tiny, super elite society, and yet both presidential candidates were bonesmen.
Right.
What can't we get rid of, Peter, no matter who we elect, no matter what their professed political ideology or religious background? What is back behind that curtain?
Well, that's the whole kicker, isn't it? I mean, it seems to me impossible when I started to do the statistical research and realized only 15 people a year are inducted into Skull and Bones. To have so many people in the administration right now as bonesmen and running against John Kerry, who was also a bonesman, seems to strain coincidence. I mean, you can't look at that and say, well, it just happened that way. Does it have something to do with the kind of meritocracy that you were talking about? Does it have something to do with this idea that the strong shall rule the weak and the Skull and Bones people are the strong? Look at it from that point of view. Strong from whose perspective? The oligarchy, as we call them, who might be struggling to maintain their grip on the country. But it wasn't just John Kerry and George Bush. That misses the point. It was Porter Goss who is the director of the CIA, appointed by George W. Bush. John Negroponte, who is the intelligence czar that we have right now, were both members of the Fence Club, which was the sort of sister fraternity to Skull and Bones.
Is it still around, the Fence Club?
Oh, sure. Fence Club still exists. They have a newsletter and everything else, which is where some of this information came from. So we have, in one fell swoop, we have George Herbert Walker Bush, George W. Bush. We have a brother, William Henry Bush, who's called Bucky Bush. He's the kid brother of the former President Bush. John Kerry, Porter Goss, John Negroponte, all members of secret societies that were operating at Yale University at the time. So what are the odds of that? You know, there are just too many people who belong to the society. If there's only 15 per year, the percentage of the American population that are members of Skull and Bones is something like 0.0000001%. How do they all wind up in positions of power? How is it that our intelligence agencies are being run by members of secret societies, and the administration itself is run by a member of a secret society, and he can't even talk about it? You know, a bonesman is not allowed to discuss Skull and Bones with a non-bonesman. And I've been dying for a journalist, somebody, somewhere in the press corps, when the president is speaking and he's asking for questions, I'm dying for a journalist to get up there and ask him about Skull and Bones, but it's never happened. I just want to see if Bush does what he's supposed to do, turn around and walk away.
The New York Times reporter David Rosenbaum, who was murdered recently in what appeared to be a mugging in Washington, was retired, 63 years old. I believe he was working on a story, or a book perhaps, about bonesmen in the current administration and their influence, and trying to determine whether or not there was an overriding policy that they all espouse. But one thing is quite clear. It goes beyond ideology. It's not political ideology, because in terms of political ideology, John Kerry and George Bush are just poles apart.
Sure.
There's something else back there, and I think it gets back to your original discussion of our needing an enemy, and once communism was defeated, now we have created, and I mean created. We did this. We created a new enemy in the Muslim world by the support first of, not just support of Israel. That's not true. Israel could have come into being without making an enemy of the Muslim world if it had been done correctly, but support very specifically of something that was done quite recently by Benjamin Netanyahu, which was the settlements, the incursion settlements into current Palestinian territory. That began the process of radicalizing the Muslim world, which was then completed by our invasion of Iraq. And for example, the Iranian people were moderate. They were very Western-oriented until the invasion of Iraq, and now they have elected a fundamentalist to replace their moderate president, and they're building nuclear bombs. So when I say we did that, we did that. Now, so behind ideology, political ideology, maybe Skull and Bones has got a deeper agenda. Maybe it's a religious agenda. Is that possible?
I think it might be if we broaden our terms, what we call religion. I mean, from all evidence, and there's not a lot of evidence to be sure, but from all evidence, Skull and Bones appears to have been a transplant from Europe of a kind of an Illuminati or Rosicrucian society, which means that they were involved in what academics these days would call Christian Kabbalah, not the Madonna version, but pure Kabbalah, but reinterpreted from a Christian point of view. So it's a kind of Christian occultism that was frowned upon by some members of the established church, but which was supported by others. Martin Luther was supposed to be involved in it and studying it and appreciating it, and other members of the Protestant Reformation had some kind of knowledge of Christian Kabbalah and brought it over to this country as early as the 17th century with the German settlements in Pennsylvania. So it appears as though there might have been an occult agenda behind it, as opposed to a purely religious one. And that may be what happened in our last election with Kerry and Bush, both bonesmen, because it looked like for a long time the vote could have gone either way. And in either case, we would have wound up with the bonesmen in the White House. The outward manifestation of the political ideology is quite different, as you pointed out. There could be no greater difference than Kerry and Bush in the method of approach. But we still have two very wealthy families. We have a lot of money, a lot of prestige. We have two Yale bonesmen. And they must share, at some point, they must share a common worldview. And this may be the worldview that was shattered when Clinton was elected. Because when Clinton was elected, after he essentially defused all of that and made the Republicans so mad, so angry, they tried to do whatever they could to get rid of him. I'm not trying to be an apologist for the Clinton administration, but watching
there is a problem. There is a very big problem. I mean, politically, I'm a moderate. When I was growing up and becoming politically aware, Eisenhower was president of the United States.
There you go. Sure.
And that was a whole different kind of republicanism, believe you me.
Absolutely.
Very, very different from when Richard Nixon came along. I knew the bad guys had gotten a hold of that party, and they've never been gotten rid of. When the day that Nelson Rockefeller was booed out of the Republican National Convention, I thought to myself, the tide has risen now.
Yeah.
This is trouble. And then Barry Goldwater, and everybody laughed at what a fool he was. And now that same kind of guy runs the country. I have said on my website, and I'll say it here, without saying that I am definitely a liberal Democrat, I'm not. Or I'm not a conservative Republican either. I sort of like to pick and choose what I think works. And but I think we're embroiled right now in the worst administration in the history of the United States at every single level. And that is what it has come down to, a kind of the tide has risen to its highest point. And where we are right now is in a space where we're going to lose our empire, American power, and it will come down amid the rubble of the fall of the dollar within the next 2 or 3 years. Or another thing will happen. We are so heavily in debt that President's Tax Commission recently promoted a series of recommendations that are essentially the largest increase in taxes in the history of this country. If the Republicans get back in office at the midterm elections, those tax increases will go through, and the national debt will be transferred from the government from its bonds into the hands of the ordinary man, and the weight will be too great to bear, and we will collapse from within instead of from without. Those are our choices because of what we have, because of the Republican Party. And I'm sorry to say that. I know it's going to make a lot of people mad, but face facts. We got it. A great party ended up in the hands of some bad people.
Well, it did, and the Republican Party was something to admire and emulate back in those days, in the Eisenhower days, as you rightly mentioned. It was Eisenhower who saw what was happening. It was Eisenhower who, on his last days, tried to warn the American people that the country was going down the tubes because of the military-industrial complex, the term that he used for his last speech. And he said that our problem is a spiritual problem, that we're losing our soul. And I think what's happening is we're losing our soul and our identity as Americans because of what this party now in power has done to re-identify and redefine what it means to be an American. And I think that is what I really resent most of all, to be considered to be un-American if you're against the policies of the current administration. But that's how they've managed to manipulate the dialogue on this issue. So they're changing reality. If we're talking about mind control or psychological warfare, they're doing a pretty good job. I mean, they have changed the reality so much that Democrats are afraid to speak out and say what's really going on. And we have Democrats who are timid in the face of all this, looking for any excuse they can to attack the party on some grounds other than the real substantive issues. They're afraid to do that because they don't own the dialogue anymore. They don't own the vocabulary. The Republicans have redefined it for the rest of us. If you're against Bush, you're not patriotic. You're not American. if you're not a neocon, if you're not a right-winger. Ann Coulter has more or less laid down that gauntlet, hasn't she? You know, anyone who is not pro neoconservatism is obviously stupid or weak-willed or weak-minded or a communist or something.
We're going to take a little break. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're talking to Peter Levenda, Sinister Forces, his new book, Book 2, A Warm Gun. Get it from the unknowncountry.com bookstore. Get it in your local bookstore, but get it. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're back talking to Peter Levenda about Sinister Forces. And we were talking about neoconservatism and George Bush, and sort of you were doing something that I'm not sure is quite accurate, which is connecting the two. And there is, because the reason I say that is I know a lot of people in Congress, both elected officials and people in their offices. You'd be amazed at how many people know there's something real behind the close encounter phenomenon, the UFOs, and they always end up wanting to talk to me. Once they get elected, about a year or two later, almost quite often I end up getting called to just chat. But in any case, there's a revolution going on in the Republican Party, quiet under the surface, because there's a lot of Republicans who remember that speech of Eisenhower's and are heeding that warning now. And I think that may be what saves us, because Bush is becoming very much an isolated factor in the Republican Party. He is not liked. People don't even want him around when they're campaigning anymore. And people like Rick Santorum are in full-scale rebellion under the surface, no matter what he may say on the surface. So it's hopeful that kind of republicanism will reemerge out of the rubble of this terribly incompetent would-be dictatorship. And, you know, it's so funny that it's like Nazism, which was spectacularly incompetent. That was the main feature of it. Like, when they had at Stalingrad, they had all their armies surrounded, and they were trying to fly plane loads of supplies in for the army, and they would open these supply planes and find 750 left shoes and things.
Right.
And then you come forward in time and you look at FEMA, run by an arrogant little jerk. You look at this latest thing that was on 60 Minutes a couple of weeks ago about the Department of Health and Human Services not buying a new drug that can save people from radiation sickness. And you look at the head of the department is this arrogant little oily twerp, and you know. And you have to think to yourself, is there somebody there back behind the scenes who wants us to suffer? Who wants if a dirty bomb goes off in the United States, who wants the maximum amount of suffering and casualty so that we will cleave to the authority of the presidency? What do they want, Peter? And I'm going a little bit beyond your book now. Although it deals with modern times, and there's so much more to discuss, folks. It's awesome. But what do they want, Peter?
Well, I mean, you put your finger on it. I memean, you're talking about a dirty bomb going off in the U.S., maximum amount of damage because FEMA and everybody else is so disorganized. We ask ourselves, is this deliberate or is it planned? And my reaction to it is, does it matter? We don't know if it's deliberate or planned. We don't know if it's just gross incompetence because the administration is so focused on the so-called war on terror, which is kind of a philosophical idea that doesn't really hold very well, but let's just call it the war on terror. It's so focused on that it's drained resources and attention from everything else. That's a possibility. That it sees this struggle as the ultimate struggle, the way Reagan was fighting communism. It could be that our current president feels that he's duplicating Reagan's attack on communism by attacking terrorism, as if the two things were the same.
Well,
so you might
but
have
the difference
that.
is that communism was actually there, and what he's attacking is more like a windmill. And if you say he's trying to protect us against terrorist attack, I beg to differ. There are 2 ports in the United States that have been hardened, as it were, with detecting equipment against the arrival of nuclear weapons concealed aboard a ship. And research into detecting plutonium from a distance has been bogged down for years. Why didn't they put a lot more money into that research right after 9/11? Why didn't we put the detectors we do have out? It's been years, and they just don't do a thing.
It's not glamorous enough. They'd rather spend the money on something glamorous like marching into Baghdad. That's something everybody can get their minds around. Seeing the American flag fly in the desert and deposing Saddam Hussein, a guy, by the way, that we pretty much put into power like we did with Osama. So, it's theater and it's spectacle. I mean, there's nothing really sexy about hardening our ports and detecting plutonium as it comes in. When the bombs go off, it'll be what September 11th was, a Reichstag fire. It will be an excuse for the party in control to extend its control even further. Because once we're afraid, once we feel that our security has been threatened, we're willing to give up liberties. This is the thing that's very scary, but something that every administration knows. It's something that Bush knows right now, and he's made no mistake about it in warrantless searches and all the electronic eavesdropping that we've been talking about. Bush doesn't understand what the problem is. He's the president, he can do it. And he's not getting a lot of opposition on this in the press. They're all scratching their heads and wondering, is this legal? Well, of course it's not legal, crying out loud. If it is, somebody's changed the law since I went to school. But we're willing to undergo these horrible things. We're willing to undergo a Katrina and willing to undergo a 9/11 as long as we can put our faith and our resources behind a president who's going to tell us everything is going to be okay. I'm going to go and get all the bad guys. We as Americans understand this. We have this cowboy and Indian mentality. We can't solve problems logically or realistically anymore. We're too caught up in what the actors did to us back in the Reagan years. We had the actors telling us how the world worked. We had the actors telling us that our conflict with communism was not a political conflict, but a spiritual conflict, as Reagan wrote to the World Anti-Communist League back in the 80s, which was, by the way, a neo-fascist organization that was putting ex-Nazis in the Republican Party to help get the captive nations on board. I mean, it boggles the mind. It boggles the mind. And we may say, and we're very correct in saying that President Bush is not a Nazi, he has no Nazi sympathies. I believe that as well. However, the party itself has been under the control of people whose sentiments are there. Reagan, during his years, I'm sorry, kissed up to a lot of Nazis, Nazi war criminals, and neo-Nazis. Nixon did the same thing. Nixon helped them get into the country under paperclip in cooperation with Allen Dulles of the CIA. That stuff is documented. That paperwork exists. You can look it up. It's there. So we have to ask ourselves these very serious questions. Is the party that has historically since World War II defended and protected people like the Nazis, regardless of how the Republicans themselves feel about it, regardless of how much repugnance they may feel in dealing with Nazis, they felt it was okay. They felt it had to be done because victory was necessary at any price. Is that what it means to be an American? Is that what this is all about? Is that what our elections are all about? Is it all about power at any price? Is it all about dealing with the devil? Because we've dealt with the devil, we've been burned so many times in the past, and now we're doing it again. Is this who we are as people? Aren't we better than this? In the arguments I've had with Nazis and neo-Nazis in this country, in the United States, they've told me all these terrific plans and for ridding the world of this vermin and that vermin and this this inferior race and that one. I've said to them, is this the only solution? Is this the only idea you have in your head as human beings, as in your case the master race, the members of the Nazi Party of the Third Reich? Your only solution is to go and kill all of your enemies. That is the most barbaric, primitive, savage solution I've heard of. and this comes from the country of Beethoven and Nietzsche and Wagner and Bach, and Goethe. This is it? Kill all the enemies, kill all the bad guys, and
well, it comes from a country that is surrounded, and it came from a country that felt surrounded and oppressed, and what it is at its core is an outburst of tribalism, of primitive tribal thinking, where the other person is not human. The other person is something less than human. And it is reflected in our modern world, in the thinking of people like the people in Skull and Bones and in those other secret societies, in the Fence Club and in that other one that Porter Goss is involved in, the Order of the Book and Snake.
Right.
All of these are the same. They are elitist. Book and Psi Upsilon, which was a fraternalist, a friendly society at the beginning, but then became more and more based on ancestry. In other words,
yes,
an elite. And what has happened is the idea of the master race has been replaced by the idea of a tiny, interconnected elite whose will to mastery can be concealed behind the curtain of ideology, politics, and religion. Does that make sense to you?
That's perfect sense. That's really what I've been saying. I think you've encapsulated it very well. That's what we're up against right now.
Peter,
and how do you fight against something like that?
You and I are going to go on talking. We are reaching the end of our time together on Dreamland, and we're going to be talking about Porter Goss, about George Bush Sr.'s brother, and we're going to try to get into some of the deeper and more sinister things that are out there, such as what Peter refers to as the Night of the Long Knives, and suddenly the Sharon Tate murders are going to enter into this in a very unexpected way. So stay tuned. If you're a subscriber to Dreamland, to this website, please listen up. And if not, well, stay tuned in any case, because Linda Moulton Howe is going to come up here next. She's got a fabulous report for us today, as always, and we'll be right back. You're about to experience something that you just can't get elsewhere. Emmy Award-winning science reporter Linda Moulton Howe reporting on the absolute leading edge of science, discovery, and the true mysteries of the unknown. Don't miss her website, earthfiles.com, the one science website that tells you the secrets and gives you the facts the others dare not. earthfiles.com. This week she has a remarkable report on our future from one of the great futurists in the world. What are the leading trends for 2006? Here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. On the last day of January 2006, President George Bush presented his State of the Union. Iraq and his administration's war against terrorists were at the top of his priorities. On the same day, the United Nations International Atomic Energy Agency reported that Iran has now obtained documents and drawings in the black market that serve no other purpose than to make an atomic warhead. And where would Iran get atomic bomb information? Probably from Russia, where it's known that weapons and documents were sold on the black market when the Soviet Union collapsed. One American who saw a big threat in the Soviet black market is Gerald Celente, publisher for 15 years of the Trends Journal based in Rhinebeck, New York. USA Today and CNBC call him one of the best trend analyzers in the business. In his 1997 book about trends in 2000, Gerald Celente warned that the Soviet black market could literally blow up in the world's face if Russian-made suitcase nukes were sold to terrorists. Now, a decade later, as 2006 begins, the world is increasingly worried about nuclear attacks and what will happen to economies if a nightmare explodes. I asked Gerald Celente this week about the major trends that he sees this year, including the increasing demand for gold, the so-called anxiety metal, and whether he thinks Iran will force a nuclear confrontation with the United States.
Iran, if the situation is unfolding the way it is being played out in the media and from the reports that I read, is that coming from Israel, for the last several months, there have been trial balloons being sent up from the Israeli government about a preemptive attack on Iran. Also, the United States is saying that military is not an option that they're going to take off the table, and that the threats that are coming out now are not of Iran attacking a U.S. facility or ally, but rather Iran being attacked first. I don't believe that at this time Iran will launch any kind of war outside their borders, because they would know they'd be annihilated in a second. Mm-hmm. They don't have the wherewithal. However, if Iran is attacked, it will be the beginning of World War III.
Right.
There are 70 million Persians. They will not be attacked or invaded by a foreign power, and they will launch a world war of weapons of mass destruction. And they don't have to be sent over by a missile. They could come in the size of suitcase-sized nuclear weaponry. When gold prices start rising, as they have been now over particularly the last year and a half, it's saying that the world is concerned about geopolitical events, economic events. It's concerned about the directions things are going. So gold is a safe haven commodity. When you worry about dollars, euros, or the future, people start putting more money into gold. It has a long history throughout civilization of being that safe haven when you need something to get you out of a big problem. The difference is now, and this is very important, what's going on now in 2006 compared to the 1970s gold rush. The biggest difference now, a number of them, 3 of them, is that number one was that back then people were buying it as a survivalist thing. It was, survival. We had the Carter years, rampant inflation, he was changing the cabinet, the mortgage rates were 21%, so people were heading for the hills. It was a survival metal. Now it's become part of a portfolio. It's a strategic buy. It's portfolio insurance. Now it's looked upon as a smart commodity to buy. Number 2, and this is very big, back in the 70s, it was basically the Americans that were playing the market. Anyone that traveled in Europe in the 1970s know it wasn't the same Europe. And there was no Japan like it is today. The Japanese were only beginning to get into the auto industry. Now you have, in 2006, not only do you have all of Europe and Japan playing the market, you've also added in China, India, and boy, the Indians love gold, and Russia, and boy, do they play the markets. You've just added 2.5 billion more people chasing a commodity that has had low production during the 1990s when the price of gold was soft. So you have a huge population chasing a commodity that has limited supply at a time of very high anxiety. So that's why I'm looking at gold now to go past 1,000 and possibly to 2,000.
Wow. And what was the third factor?
It's the debt. The Chinese holding so much of the U.S. currency. So now there is a huge attack on the dollar. The eye of this Category 5 economy, as I call it, is the weakness of the dollar. They can't raise interest rates much more because they'll shut down the U.S. economy. If they lower interest rates, Now, what is happening, the Chinese and others have announced that they're going to begin unloading dollars because low interest rates mean cheap dollars. Mm-hmm. So those are the three factors.
Okay, and that leads to a question that under Category 5, the economy on your 2006 trends list, you have the provocative subtitle, Broken China. Can you explain that?
China is growing between 9 and 10% a year for the last decade or so. They cannot sustain this kind of growth without the United States staying economically strong. The United States, at 5% of the population, consumes 20% of the world's imports. If the United States consumer goes on a swim-fast economic diet, who is China going to export all this product to that they have ramped up so vigorously to serve? Now, here's what's going on in China. According to the Chinese government, in 2004, the latest figures available, there were 75,000 riots and major disturbances throughout China. So even as their economy is soaring, this population base of 1.3 billion people is in turmoil as the peasants and others are losing the little bit that they had, and the wealth is being aggregated in the hands of a few. You have a new communist revolution taking place beneath the surface that we're not hearing about. If the United States economy slows down, as we fear it's going to, China's economy is also going to halt very rapidly. They're going to have major internal problems. They already have them during the best of times. What that also means, governments have been known to deflect internal problems. They make external problems seem more important. So look for problems with China and Taiwan, China in the South Sea with the Philippines and Vietnam. Look for more problems from China in relationship to their relations with other nations.
And if China and the United States economically stumbled at the same time, what do you think would happen in the whole world?
We can see a global recession. It's already beginning. And the United States is going to get hit the hardest of any nation other than China. China's expanded way too fast, and the world cannot consume. There's a glut of product on the world, in the world supply chain. The United States gets hit the worst because we're in the worst economic condition. The bubble that's going to burst is going to be the debt bubble. It's as simple as that. The latest figures are showing that America's savings rate is at 1933 levels, Depression-era levels. These are real facts. The total U.S. budget deficit, including the corporate and the household debt, has passed the Depression-level high of 200% of the nation's gross domestic product. The bubble that's going to happen is that refinancing bubble that was brought about by 46-year low interest rates following 9/11 to recently, that allowed people to take out these home equity loans and go on a spending spree and buy more real estate and bigger real estate than they ever had before. Now there's going to be a credit crunch. So when the world economy, when the United States economy slows down, we can no longer afford to pay our debt load, whether it's personal debt load, corporate debt load, or government debt load. And that's another reason why gold is going up. They may devalue the dollar before it's all said and done.
And how does all of this fit into another one of your trends for 2006 called Workers of the World, having to do with labor movements in this country?
Labor movements historically begin to pick up steam when the economy turns the worst. And this you could go throughout history. For instance, if you go back to the Depression, that's when we had the real last labor movement of any great significance. It had slowed down during the Roaring '20s, when there was great economic wealth being generated throughout the nation. Now things are slowing down again. The jobs that haven't been exported are the jobs that are going to be unionized. The poultry workers, slaughterhouse, the hospitality workers, restaurant workers, retail stores. These are the same kind of jobs, for instance, that were relative to the immigrants that were coming over at the turn of the century. The lower end of the economic scale. The garment workers, the truck drivers and auto workers at the time. Now those workers have gotten better benefits, the auto workers, so now they're reunionizing the lower end of the economic scale, the jobs that can't get exported, because unlike the high-paying labor jobs where they could bring in scab labor to replace them, you can't do that if you're going to put an ad in the newspaper, restroom attendants wanted, $7.50 an hour. You're not going to have a lot of scabs trying to take those kind of jobs.
And what happens if in the summer of 2006 we have another Katrina or two?
The economy could crash if we have another natural disaster or a man-made disaster. It's barely holding up now. Oil prices keep moving up. Gold keeps going new highs for the last 25 years. There's a lot of problems. We cannot afford to take an economic hit. If we have another event such as a Katrina, where it's in a predominantly poor area, we're going to start also seeing, as this gap between the rich and the poor widens, we're going to start seeing more civil strife. The people are beginning to understand or believe that if you're very wealthy in this country, you have it made. Whether it's crime or anything else, you're going to get off easy. But if you're not, then you're going to get hit really hard. And Katrina opened up and showed a side of America that a lot of people, particularly around the world, didn't think was very flattering to a democratic country.
And you call this survival of the fittest on your 2006 trends. And I was curious, in your own mind, what is the difference between survival of the fittest in the face of hurricanes and tsunamis and earthquakes and all of the possible epidemics, and another list, a title on your list, which is outside the system, off the grid?
Well, the survival of the fittest, again, whether it's man-made or by Mother Nature, when terror strikes, you're on your own. And people have to grow up to this. The government's not going to be there to help you. They're not here to help you now. When you're in your need, they're not going to help you if a crisis hits. They've showed that they're inept in doing this, whether it's in a military conflict or a local disaster. Either side of the aisle, both of the parties, they're not going to be there. You're on your own. And terror is going to strike, whether it's man-made or by Mother Nature. We just heard the former head of the 9/11 Commission, former Republican Governor Thomas Keane, say that the nation is not prepared for another terror strike, and that if it happens, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Mm-hmm. So when terror strikes, what are you going to do? And that's what the survival of the fittest is about. And we're going to continue to see it grow, whether it's in the areas of people being fearful of pandemics such as bird flu, mad cow, people taking more responsibility to protect themselves emotionally, financially, and physically, whether it's immune system buildup or building up your bank book or assets in a way that you can protect them. And getting off the grid is going to happen because we're going to begin to see new developments in technology in the fields of self-sustaining energy, water purification systems, and you're already seeing it with the Internet, where people are becoming more and more self-reliant and getting off the grid. There are systems out there from Denmark, for instance, where you don't have to pay for telephone calls. They're doing it over the Internet for free. Mm-hmm. There's going to be a time when you're not going to need that electricity. You're going to be able to generate it with your own unit. And there's a website to go to for more information on the latest of new alternative energy developments. It's called infinite-energy.com. And these are real scientists, and they are real breakthroughs, which brings me to something that I've just been thinking about that visionaries and others that want to look ahead and see ahead should begin to contemplate. And that is, what will the world landscape look like geopolitically when we no longer need oil?
Very good question.
It's going to look like just as it did when we no longer needed the silk routes or the spice routes. Things change. New developments start to happen. New alliances are formed. So with all of the negative, there's positive. There's a lot of change developing now. And if we move ahead in the right direction, we have enough information from the past to know what works well and what doesn't. And if we take that information, that deep library and reservoir of information, and push forward with it, we can actually have a new renaissance. Because with this new alternative energy, it's going to be as important as the discovery of fire and the invention of the wheel.
But aren't the same companies, Shell and Exxon and on, in control of alternative energy system development as well?
No, they're not. They can make it happen in the sense that if they funded it, it could happen quicker. But you know, the old saying is that necessity is the mother of invention. And just as the people that were making horse and carriages and had that market cornered couldn't stop the automobile, neither will the big oil companies. And it's happening, as I said, when you see the developments that are happening in zero-point energy, in charged clusters and permanent magnets, and even in cold fusion, and what they call hydrino power, you can see this is going to be very shortly emerging on the horizon as the necessity becomes, particularly in capitalistic societies, if the consumer is putting all their disposable income into energy, how are they going to buy consumer products? And 2/3 of the nation's GDP is generated by consumer spending. So when oil prices or gasoline prices hit $4 a gallon, $4 a gallon, that's the time when government, when investors, when venture capitalists start putting the money behind alternative energy.
It seems like the 2006 trend picture has paradox in it, meaning that it's possibly likely that the American economy, and maybe China with it, will stumble and have some really rough times, and yet the declining oil supply in the world is going to be forcing entrepreneurial spirit to expand business.
Precisely. You know, the thing about the future that's wonderful about it is that we really shape the future that we want to have in so many ways. We're all doing in life what we're doing at this very moment because of decisions that we made in the past. And the same thing holds true whether it's an individual, a community, a state, a nation, or a planet. And if we put our direction into the kinds of goals, missions, and objectives that create a world in which is more self-sustaining and less destructive, then we can have that world.
And yet, one of your top trends is the uglier American.
And that's very true. Around the world, America has gone from the most admired nation on earth to the most despised for a variety of reasons. The Iraq War, of course, being the main one at the moment, but also the United States abrogating environmental treaties, not standing by in the eyes of others, prisoner of war protocols, etc. So when we look at the ugly Americans, we also understand that they don't rule the world. There's only 300 million Americans in a sea of 6.3 billion. Mm-hmm. So as these trends are developing that can show a new renaissance, it's not all of America that's moving in one direction of maybe destruction and backward thinking. There's also elements in America that are creating new horizons, coming out with some of the most innovative, dynamic, and futuristic products available. So that's going on simultaneously. How we end up or how we move ahead That depends on the course that the people want to take.
A big positive trend is that everything you see, watch, and hear on the Internet now can be put on your living room's widescreen TV soon. Gerald Celente thinks there could be a first full-time Internet candidate in the 2008 presidential election. The Internet to TV technology will mean a serious candidate can bypass expensive TV network advertising and run a campaign only on the Internet. And finally, as Mideast dangers continue and gas prices rise, Americans are shrinking from all the chaos and uncertainty by looking back at an elusive golden age when life seemed simpler. That sentimental journey, as Gerald Celente calls it, is appealing to both generations of the baby boomers and their children. A big emerging trend is cutting back on everything, to smaller cars, simpler living, spending less, having less, but choosing higher quality and more time to walk and breathe away from work. To keep up with the trends of 2006 and beyond, visit Gerald Celente's website at www.trendsjournal.com. And Whitley, one of the things about this looking at trends upcoming, and Gerald and I have talked about this privately, that what is always off the radar because it is still politically unacceptable to discuss is the final confirmation of other life in the universe. What would that do to all of the trends that we've just discussed?
Well, Linda, it would really, really throw everything into a sort of a cocked hat. For one thing, it would change the face of the public's attitude toward presidential candidates and government in general, as well as the media, because it would mean that the whole thing has been animated for years by a big fat lie that they've all known about. Mm-hmm. And I think actually that government will be less damaged than media. I think it would destroy the credibility permanently destroy the credibility of a lot of the big media, because it will be inescapable that they have knowingly lied, or what they, I think, have really done for the most part is that this is a very, it's an emotional issue, especially for intelligent, highly educated people like reporters and people in newspapers and TV studios and so forth. These are people who want to believe that they run things, that they are at the top of the culture's food chain. And to discover that there's somebody else out there farther along than they are, who basically wants nothing to do with them, is not acceptable to them. And I've seen them react viscerally on an emotional level time and time again, rejecting clear, calmly and correctly presented and entirely credible evidence in favor of an emotional response that it just can't be true, basically because it disturbs me, Reporter X, too much.
Right. And what do you think, if there was some irrefutable proof, and it might be discs showing up in the sky, I'm not sure it would be, what impact do you think it would have on the Iran, Iraq, Middle East turmoil?
Well, it would have the impact, a lot of impact on everything. It would, for example, it would make people look up, and that changes the way people are when they look up, Linda. It might have a salubrious effect. On the other hand, it happened. It happened in Japan in the 18th century, where UFOs hung over cities for days at a time. The government collapsed. The whole place went into a state of collapse. Linda, we're coming to the end of our time together. I'm going to have to cut us both off. Thank you very much.
But we already put it into religious terms because the communists were against religion. And we went from there into now states which have different gods than we do. I mean, it's a very tight little thick kind of nucleus that we're now involved in struggling to get out of. And unless we can change the vocabulary of this type of struggle, we are stuck with it. We are stuck with fighting religious war.
And yet, there is something very wrong here. There's a discordant note. It would be one thing if the knights of religion were actually the knights of the religion they pretend to defend. But that's not quite true. It would be, let's start. We're going to get, of course, into Skull and Bones and that all of the secret societies and so on and so forth in a few minutes. We're going to be discussing Porter Goss, by the way, folks, who's an interesting and scary guy, and who happens to now to run the CIA and is almost certainly running it into the ground beyond, I mean, how deep can it be driven into the ground? I don't know. But anyway, let's start with Nancy Reagan and something that does not fit the fundamentalist Christian modality at all, which is her use of astrology. And we're going to get into Gene Dixon, too. But let's start with Nancy Reagan.
Well, Nancy Reagan is a fun place to start. I mean, we are looking at a former actress, as Ronald Reagan was a former actor. We suddenly have people who are schooled in the art of becoming other people in the first place. Maybe in the case of Reagan and Nancy, maybe not that well. I mean, we're talking about basically D-list movie stars, but they were Hollywood figures. They were actors and actresses, an actor and an actress. These were people who understood about manipulating reality. When we talk about Nancy Reagan, we talk about a person who looked behind the veil of reality, let's say, just from her own life and her own marriage to Ronald Reagan, and saw that astrology was a way of understanding or controlling or manipulating or dealing with this unseen world that as actors and actresses, some drama professionals do come in contact with through method acting, through the Stanislavski method and all of that. They imitate hypnotic states. They imitate trance states, in a sense, shamanistic states. So we have Nancy Reagan, a devoted fan of astrology, with really exorbitant power in the White House, especially after the assassination attempt on Reagan, who is now basically organizing the president's schedule around astrology. Now, this was something that was done in many ancient cultures around the world. It was done in ancient China. It was done in India. It was done in Europe for a long time. There were viziers, or there were advisors to kings and emperors who used astrology to determine when a date was good for a battle or for a coronation, that sort of thing. And in Nancy Reagan, we simply have another manifestation of the same thing. However, those of us in the rest of the world who may or may not really ascribe to notions of astrology were horrified to learn that Nancy Reagan was setting up the schedule of the most powerful man in the world based upon astrological portents. And the problem with astrology in this case is that it's only as good as the astrologer you're using. So we had to hope, keep our fingers crossed, that Nancy's astrologer was really top-notch, because if she wasn't, we would have had a problem on our hands, possibly. During World War II, astrology
who was Nancy's astrologer?
Oh, I forget her name. It's in my book, I believe, but I...
Oh, okay.
Totally
well, we won't. Obviously, yeah. That's not a path we need to go down then, because
I don't think we need to. No.
Okay. Now, that does not really jibe very well with fundamentalism of Christianity, which is a specific prohibition against consulting soothsayers, and astrology and fundamentalism are not mixed.
Well, I kind of look at Ronald and Nancy as the sort of New Age and religion, or let's say politics and spirituality, are separated. I mean, they're separated in our Constitution by law, the separation of church and state. However, that doesn't really happen in reality. We have religious people in political positions or positions of political power making decisions that may be formed by spiritual or religious ideas, some of which may be shocking to us if we knew what they were. So I began to research the connections between church and state, if you will, between political figures and their occult or religious beliefs. And I found just an enormous treasure trove of material that people ordinarily ignore. And I think it's important to look at this material because the people making decisions affecting all of our lives are people who have religious or spiritual ideas with which we may not really agree. We had a president, Ronald Reagan, who was a firm believer in the end of days, in the apocalyptic prophecies of the Bible.
We have another one now, George Bush. Now, let's just stop right here, because this is very important. In fact, the book of Revelation and the prospect of the impending end of days have animated American foreign policy thinking for almost 2 generations at this point. First with the Reagan administration, and now with this second Bush administration. And tell us a little bit about, first starting with Reagan, how this has affected our political life and our country's life and our foreign policy.
Well, what it did is it elevated, if you will, the discussion about politics between capitalism and communism back in the 1980s, in the time of the Cold War, into a spiritual discussion. And this is what was so disturbing to me, was because suddenly we are casting our political enemies as spiritual enemies. It's the war between light and darkness. Now, that was fine for the conservatives, for Republican outlook. I mean, the Republicans detested the Democratic approach, which was more of appeasement or negotiation or finding some sort of common ground. The Republican political philosophy was not to enter into these types of negotiations, but to expend power as much as possible. And the only way to get most Americans in the 1980s, the me generation, behind this kind of political idea was to cast it in spiritual terms. Suddenly the Soviet Union became the evil empire. It was a satanic organization. All of this type of end-of-days vocabulary Reagan used with abandon. And what that did was set us up for what is happening now. By casting international politics in a religious or spiritual conflict paradigm, what we've done is we've opened the door for other groups that have spiritual agendas to cast us as the enemy, to cast us as the warriors of darkness versus the warriors of light. This is the kind of a situation we can't easily get out of at this point. We have got to address our enemies now in these spiritual terms. I mean, communism basically has been destroyed, or at least it's been quieted down considerably. The Soviet Union fell. Cuba is surrounded and struggle is hardly recognizable as a communist state anymore. So who becomes the enemy? Once Reagan put everything into this end of days book of Revelation context, it didn't just suddenly go away. I mean, the Messiah didn't come, the third temple wasn't built. None of the things that the apocalyptic neocons are looking for have taken place yet. So obviously we need another spiritual enemy. And I think we found spiritual enemies in the Middle East, for instance. So now we are involved in a relationship in the Middle East that is tailor-made for the neoconservatives and some Christian elements who want to ensure that a third temple in Israel is built. And the only way that's going to happen is that if there is a war with the Middle East, Arab countries, Islamic countries, in which a way is paved for the building of the temple on what is now the Dome of the Rock. I mean, we went from fighting communism, godless communism, remember that? I mean, we
what I consider one of the penultimate authors in the world today, Peter Levenda, has come out with book 2 of Sinister Forces. And you remember, I'm sure, the book 1 interview we did. If you're an unknowncountry.com subscriber, you can listen to that interview again if you wish. It is still in the subscriber section. And in any case, that or not, you can listen to this interview, and believe me, this is no sequel, but rather a continuation into modern times with all new material and new facts. Book 1 stopped pretty much with the Kennedy assassination, but that was not the end of this problem. And Peter, I think that the best way to start with you, first, welcome to the show again.
Oh, thank you very much.
Oh, yes.
Happy to be here.
Oh, well, I'm delighted to have you here. My respect for Peter Levenda is just boundless for the effort that he's making. Anyway, what is the problem? You call this series a grimoire of American political witchcraft. Why?
That's a very good question, actually. I took the idea of political witchcraft from an article that had appeared in the Village Voice right around the time of the Watergate hearings had just begun. And a journalist by the name of Craig Carpel had written a two-part series in the Village Voice called Political Witchcraft. And it sort of blew me away because what he did is he juxtaposed things like the Manson killings with Richard Nixon proclaiming Manson guilty, and then going on to E. Howard Hunt, who was one of the Watergate burglars, former CIA officer at the Bay of Pigs. And E. Howard Hunt had written a series of occult novels, and he started bringing all of these various threads in a very short two-part series. And it really ignited something inside of me, and I said, this is a fascinating way to look at our modern age. We're so used to, in the United States, of thinking that politics